Mrs. Clements, will you tell us what you saw as you drove up to your house on the night of July the 22nd, 1973?
Well, I'd seen the fire engines as I had turned into the square, and then, as I got closer, I noticed that they were outside our house, and there were 2 white police cars. There seemed to be a lot of people standing about, but I'm afraid I don't remember it all very clearly. I was quite terrified.
Of course, it's quite understandable. Did you notice anything in particular, though?
Yes. As I drove up, and I parked the car and opened the door to get out, a figure sort of... Well, I know it sounds peculiar, but this figure really did seem to rise up out of the hedge. I was terribly startled. This person really seemed to spring up out of nowhere.
Could you tell whether it was a man or a woman?
Oh, it was definitely a man. I'm quite sure about that.
Could you describe this man?
Yes, he was very tall indeed, and he seemed to be wearing a pale-coloured jacket or pullover, and his hair was quite long.
That's quite a useful description, Mrs. Clements. Obviously, you have a very quick eye. What did this man do?
Oh, he just ran away. When he appeared like that so suddenly, I jumped back, and then he started to run very fast and disappeared round the corner.
Did you report this incident to the police?
Yes, I did.
But not immediately.
Oh, well, no, it was about 3 weeks later.
Why did you put off getting in touch with the police, Mrs. Clements?
Oh, I didn't put it off. Not deliberately. It sounds peculiar, I know, but I'd literally forgotten all about the man. It had been completely wiped out of my mind. Well, I suppose the fright and all the chaos of the fire.
Were you not also ill for over 2 weeks after the night of the fire?
Yes, but it was nothing serious.
Serious enough for you to be admitted to the St. Juliana's Convent Nursing Home in Highgate, however.
Yes, but it was really just for the rest.
That is the same nursing home, is it not, in which you spent a fortnight in September of last year?
Yes. You see, I'm very foolish about doing too much. I get very overtired. And in July there was so much to do. I was rushing all over the country to meetings and so on, and then the fire on top of that, and then in September it was, getting all the children off to boarding school, and it was my son's first term.
It was a nervous upset of some kind, was it?
Oh, no, nothing like that. Just overtired, as I say. See, I suffer from an absurd malady. It's called anorexia. It runs in the family,
yes.
actually.
That's a loss of appetite, isn't it?
Yes. Yes. My mother had it too. You lose your appetite completely. Because it only happens to me very occasionally. When I get run down, I feel very fatigued and lose weight. But a week's rest always puts that right.
I see. At any rate, it was something like 3 weeks before you remembered about this man running away.
Yes, that's right. So I was driving up to the house one night and I parked the car in about the same spot as I had on the night of the fire. And then as I opened the door to get out, everything came back to me, just like that.
Quite. Were there any grounds for the accusations of Edward Bennington's against your husband and Mrs. Bennington?
No, none.
No such thought has ever entered your mind?
Certainly not. The idea is quite ludicrous. Jeremy is very much a family man. We have 5 children and a very happy marriage.
And as we've heard, Mrs. Bennington was very much a friend of the family. So much so that she used to stay in your house.
Yes. Jeremy didn't like the idea of her going all that way back to Barnes on her own after their late-night business conferences.
So it was Mr. Clement's idea that Mrs. Bennington should stay over those nights?
Well, we discussed it together, of course.
Of course. But your feelings towards her were entirely cordial.
Entirely?
Thank you, Mrs. Clements.
Mrs. Clements, after the night of the fire, did you ever have any dreams or nightmares about it?
Yes, I did. I still do.
Don't you think it possible that this man you think you saw was in fact one of those dreams?
No, I don't. Perfectly capable of distinguishing between dreams and reality.
Oh, doesn't it seem to you a little unlikely, Mrs. Clements, that this man should have set fire to your house and then not run off until long after the fire brigade and the police had already arrived?
Well, I'm afraid I'm not very familiar with the way the mind of an arsonist might work.
Until the memory of this man came back to you, did you assume, as did your husband and Mrs. Bennington, of course, that it was the accused who started the fire?
No, I didn't.
No? With the painting of the message on the pavement, who do you think had done that?
Oh, yes, well, of course, I knew he must have done that. It was the same things he wrote on the pavement.
Stop screwing my wife.
Yes.
So, although you were sure that the accused had done the writing on the pavement, you were not so sure about the fire?
No.
In spite of the obscene letters and telephone calls he'd been making?
Yes, in spite of that.
Why?
Well, I'd spoken to him, you see. I'd taken one of those phone calls.
Well, what was it he said to you, Mrs. Clements?
Well, he just kept saying these foul things about my husband, but that I told him to stop. And there was a pause, and he asked who was speaking. So I told him. And then he said, "I'm sorry," and put the phone down.
And it was this that made you feel he was not responsible for the fire?
Well, yes. There was something in his voice about the way he spoke to me. I mean, he really did sound sorry.
So it was always your opinion, Mrs. Clements, that the writing on the pavement and the fire were two separate acts?
Yes.
Well, most people would find that the most extraordinary coincidence.
Oh, yes, I expect they would. People always seem to think that coincidences are rare and sort of surprising. I don't agree with them at all. I think they happen all the time. It's just that, well, we're not aware of them.
Mrs. Clements, a somewhat curious feature of this trial is that one of the accused's best friends has appeared as a witness for the prosecution, and now here you are appearing as a witness for the defense against, as it were, your own husband.
Oh, but it was Jeremy who insisted on it.
Really? It was Mr. Clements who made the charge. You're not suggesting he had doubts?
Oh, no. I'm sure he had no doubts at all, whatever about the charge. Because when I first told him about the man running away, he said he was sure he hadn't anything to do with the fire. But eventually, he said that if I felt so strongly about it, I really was obliged to appear in court as a witness. And I think he was rather surprised I went through with it.
And you honestly expect the court to believe that although the accused had done the writing on the pavement, the fire was started sometime later by a passing pyromaniac?
Yes.
No further questions?
It is clear, Mrs. Clements, that counsel for the prosecution does not share your theory about coincidence. Were any of the nightmares you'd had about the fire similar to this other memory?
Oh, no. They were nothing like that at all. They were all jumbled up and strange the way dreams are. Oh, no. This was quite ordinary. I mean, I really did see that man.
It's not I that questioned it, Mrs. Clements. It is another coincidence, isn't it, that Mrs. Bennington should bear such a very marked resemblance to your late sister Frances?
Oh, but that's not true. That woman doesn't look like anything like Frances.
That woman, Mrs. Clements?
It is just that she doesn't look like my sister.
Well, Mrs. Kent, your nanny, thought she did. She said in this court she was the image of my Miss Frances.
Nanny couldn't have said that. I mean, she's nothing like her, nothing. Well, I'm sorry to sound so. It's just that my sister...
Miss Clements, it's true, isn't it, that you suffered your first nervous breakdown at the age of 15, just after your sister had committed suicide. It's also true, is it not, that since then you've been into that discreet little nursing home 7 times, suffering from a total nervous collapse, and anorexia is only one of the symptoms.
No, I told you I was just overtired.
Mrs. Clements, are you not a virtual addict to the drugs Mandrax and Seconal?
Oh, no. No, the doctor gives them to me to help me to sleep.
Mrs. Clements, I'm sure that one of the recent causes for your insomnia was that you were perfectly aware of the sexual relationship between your husband and Mrs. Bennington.
was nothing in it. Look, I've told you that.
How?
Because I spoke to him. He isn't that kind of man. Yes, he may have written those things on the pavement, but not the fire. Look, I've already told you that I saw the other man.
Perhaps it was convenient for you to say that. Perhaps you were keeping your feelings of jealousy and anger to yourself. You're biding your time. Perhaps when Edward Bennington began his campaign of letters and phone calls, you saw a chance of revenge. Your husband has told us that more often than not, you stayed out of town on after your meetings. But unexpectedly, on the night of July the 22nd, you drove back to London. The night that someone, Mrs. Clements, poured petrol through the letterbox of your home and set it alight. Now, I suggest that this someone knew all about the highly efficient fire precautions and also that your property was very heavily insured. There was no real danger to the people inside. The same person painted words on the pavement that shouted to the world what was going on between Jocelyn Bennington and Jeremy Clements. Words that would at the same time inevitably incriminate Edward Bennington. Thank you, Mrs. Clements. That's the case for the defence, my lord.
You may leave the witness box, Mrs. Clements. Mrs. Clements, you may leave the witness box. Members of the jury, it is for me to direct you on the law, and it is for you to decide the facts. That is to say, what happened. Now, the accused is charged with a serious offence, namely that, contrary to Section 2 of the Criminal Damage Act 1971, he did on the 23rd of July 1973, without lawful excuse, damage a house belonging to Jeremy Clements, intending to destroy or damage the property, or being reckless as to whether or not it would be destroyed or damaged, and intend by so doing to endanger the life of Clements and Bennington, or being reckless as to whether their lives would be so endangered. Now, members of the jury, no one actually saw who started the fire, but there is a wealth of circumstantial evidence for you to consider. First of all, you must consider whether or not the accused started the fire. If he did not, then you must acquit him. If you think that he did start the fire, you must then go on to consider whether he did so consciously, or whether perhaps he was so drunk as to be like a sleepwalker. If you think he acted consciously, knowing the probable consequences of what he was doing, then you must find him guilty. But if you think he was acting like a sleepwalker, totally unaware of what he was doing, then you must bring in a verdict of not guilty. Remember, it is for the prosecution to prove their case beyond reasonable doubt. So if you are in reasonable doubt, you must find him not guilty. Now will you retire and consider your verdict?
All stand. Members of the jury, will your foreman please stand? Just answer this question, yes or no. Have you reached a verdict upon which you are all agreed?
Yes.
Do you find the accused, Edward Bennington, guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
Edward Bennington, the jury have found you not guilty, and you are free to leave this court.
Court will rise.
Next week, a chance to join another jury when our cameras return to the Crown Court.